So I want to welcome everyone here for this panel on blockchain beyond the hype. This is a topic Mike and I have been exploring for the last 18 months, separately but together, and sharing information. And we have a central question about what is the value, or is there any value for the use of blockchain in the public sector?
Yeah, and I think it's really important where like Mark and my psychology is on this blockchain conversation, because in my personal life, I'm an active NFT investor. I've seen a number of use cases in terms of the ecosystem that this technology is building. Certainly, I had the honor of working for Mayor Suarez here in the city of Miami and watching how much excitement there is in the space, how many companies are coming here to build. But when the rubber hits the road on city government applications, the reality is that Mark and I have had a little bit more difficulty. So we've been on the life cycle of a lot of optimism, down through the trough of disillusionment, trying to find those real use cases in this space. And debatably, we're coming on the other side, maybe or not. So we're going to have a very skeptical eye as we bring our panelists to come up here today and have a discussion about the future of blockchain inside of cities.
So I want to welcome to the stage a group of experts that will answer some very pivotal questions here and really get to the heart and the truth of the matter. I'd like to bring to the stage Karla Ballard, CEO of YING.
Round of applause, Karla.
Kyle Makinen, Enterprise Senior Manager at Polygon. Michael Mazur, Chief Operating Officer at Colu. Keith Hanson, CTO of Shreveport, Louisiana. And Winston, Lazar, CEO of Spread Networks.
Woo! Who's in charge of the cafecitos? Let's make sure we get a heavy dose for this crowd.
Keith, the first question is going to go to you. Just by way of format, we're going to ask the individual panelists a question to allow you to get to know them, and then we're going to open it up to more group conversations. And if our staff here can help us, we will facilitate questions from the audience at the end. So Keith, you're working on a very significant digital divide program for Shreveport. Explain how that has a connection back to blockchain and exactly what you're trying to achieve there.
Cool. So we are tapping into Paul and Mobile. We are deploying 5G over CBRS. Ultimately, at the end of the day, all that runs on the blockchain. I don't really care about it.
You don't really care that it's on the blockchain.
You care about the project, just not that it's on the blockchain.
Yeah, exactly. To be clear. Thanks. I appreciate that.
So I'm going to do a little bit of an intro. Some of you we're assuming that you have some basic knowledge of blockchain for this conversation on what it is, what it's not. This is not a primer. It's not a blockchain 101. But I'm going to explain one concept, which is this idea, because I'm going to ask a Web 2, Web 3 question. So the recap on Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, when we're talking about Web 1, there's a definition I like about Web 3, which is read, write, and own. Web 1 was about reading the web. Before we had social, you just go on and you'd read whatever was online. On 2, we as users had the ability to write on the web, hence the introduction of social media. And now we have ability to own in Web 3. So this question is really for Michael. On Colu, you were effectively a Web 2 organization, standard database, centralized cloud infrastructure, and you pivoted to Web 3. Tell us a little bit about that pivot and why the introduction of the blockchain was important and valuable.
Yeah, thanks for that. So today we have a Web 2 platform. The whole point of it is to help cities incentivize different behaviors. What we see with the blockchain, though, is that it enables this whole new mechanism to create ownership and, at the end of the day, get the communities activated. If you have blockchain-based, in our case, localized coins, you can really have an incentive mechanism where, unlike in Web 2, where ultimately those local coins are beholden to the city, and essentially if a technology provider goes out of business, those coins go away. With a decentralized platform, those coins are yours. And let's say I live in Miami and I want to move to Fort Lauderdale, for example, or the opposite in this case, I would be able to exchange my coins. So having it done in a decentralized way really opens it up and allows for much more interoperability between cities and communities around the world.
Thanks, Michael. That's a great segue for Karla. You've been involved with community building for a long time. You've been in the crypto space probably even longer. You have a finance background. You've got a startup that does skills matching. So can you give us some background? What is that, and why are you using blockchain behind it?
Thank you, Mark. So born and raised in Philly, so glad to have my Philadelphia CIO here. I'm Karla Ballard.
But Miami's pretty cool too, right?
Miami is phenomenal.
Okay, great.
Phenomenal. Not pretty cool. It's phenomenal. So YING is a peer-to-peer group skill sharing platform, and one of the things that we like to focus around is building a culture that cares. So I always like to say, if TaskRabbit had a baby with Venmo, her name would be YING, right? And so in many ways, we're creating the ultimate community gig platform. We just announced that we're going to be launching a Visa debit card. So when you get paid on the platform, that cash goes right there. So why the blockchain? Why does it even matter in what we're doing? We are really excited that now you have an open ledger that allows for you to, yes, understand that when transactions are being made, there's a way to acknowledge that. But now when we think about transactions, we're just thinking about fiat currency being transacted. But what's wonderful about the blockchain is we are now having an opportunity to expand the definition of what capital really means. We have several forms of capital: cultural capital, political capital, community capital, and financial capital. You could go on and on. But for really, I've always wanted us, having been in banking in the financial services industry, to understand that we have more options to acknowledge the other types of capital that exist. So a lot of what we are looking at doing is being able to have the opportunity, when I exchange my skills and my time, now we can tokenize it. We can acknowledge it with another form of a currency or token, whatever you want to call it. And you can do that now on the blockchain and allow for that to be in a way where people can truly say, now you can't hack that exchange. It's immutable, right? I won't be able to take that accounting and try to delete it. So hopefully that gives you a quick opening.
Yeah, and I'm gonna come back to this. You already know I'm gonna come back to this because I've been fascinated with the way Karla just worded something on the acknowledgement on the blockchain of work to be done. But before we do that, I want to go to Kyle. Kyle, you're with Polygon. My experience, dabbling in the open, permissionless chains. Polygon's great because it keeps my gas fees down, right? That's generally my awareness of using Polygon. But what you're doing is interesting because you're providing service solutions for permissioned blockchains. So can you talk a little bit about what you're doing in this space? And you have the open, decentralized, permissionless chain, and then you have these permission chains, which kind of seem to make more sense for us working in government, where you might have more restrictions, like we value openness, but maybe not too much openness. Talk a little bit about your experience and that tension between the permissionless, and where you think the value might be on a permission chain that is different from some of these open, decentralized discussions we've been having.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And just as a quick intro to Polygon, we did start as open public blockchain, essentially a scaler on top of Ethereum. And with that, being very good at building a global network that maintains security over billions of dollars in assets, we say, okay, there's going to be a continuum that developers care about. Every application that you deploy may have certain requirements, as Mike was mentioning. For example, visibility into the chain, transactions, the ledger, essentially privacy, transaction privacy, who can publish an application to the chain, where the chain is deployed, actual chain performance attributes like time to finality. So there's a lot of different trade-offs that developers need to consider. And so at Polygon, we said that we want to give choice to devs and figure out where they want to deploy. So for us, it's kind of a continuum. You have your public chains, Polygon POS, Ethereum, But on the permission side, which is particularly relevant to at least those cities and public use cases that are getting started, is to go with the permission route. So we have Polygon Edge, which is a sovereign chain. We call it sovereign and not permission because you can sovereignly own the chain attributes, some of which I described earlier. And from there, right, I would challenge anyone that's thinking about using a decentralized network to find some sort of attribute to enterprise tech and enterprise architectures that we can't solve for specifically to your needs. And we can probably get into that a little bit later when we talk about, again, privacy, security, and architecture. But another item to dig a little deeper that is, I think, particularly noteworthy when it comes to choice is, for public sector in particular, is when you're deploying a network, a lot of times you have to maintain the nodes, the validator set. Well, at Polygon, we have something called supernets, which you essentially outsource the validation to a set of trusted providers. And so in this case, if you're a city, you're a municipality, et cetera, and you have a killer use case that you want to bring to your citizens, and you're like, well, I'm not a pro in blockchain networking, how can I do this? Well, we have the supernets, we have that shared validator set, and what's really compelling about this is as we're democratizing this technology and make it as easy as launching a web page, that validator set could be a set of businesses within your community. So you essentially now have a community utility that people can transact, as Karla mentioned, on a shared ledger that has some digital uniqueness to it and some permanency to the transactions. But all the economic value that's being generated by the validators could be funneled back into the community. So as a city or a government, it shouldn't be daunting from an architectural perspective because the city or government doesn't have to actually be the one maintaining the network.
So just because we got a little bit technical on there,
Yeah,
I know that some folks in here are going to respond, and we will come back to some of the cases that are definitely more people-oriented. But I think what you're saying is you're providing a whole suite of solutions to match the problems that are the different problems that could arise. So it all comes back to the same thing. Know the problem that you're trying to solve for. Some use cases are perfect for an open blockchain, but in other cases, you might only want to take advantage of this validation function that is a characteristic of an open chain, but you might want to mix and match it with some of the more internal-oriented things that don't lend themselves to a fully open chain. So know the problem you're trying to solve, I think, is like always the overarching message.
And just a quick soundbite on that. I don't know whether Mike intentionally teed me up here, but there are bridges now where you can have some fluidity across your chain environment, where you can start in a permission chain and say, okay, now I want to make this something that could be traded with any person, and that's connected in this global Ethereum or Polygon network. So yeah,
so a city that may has some internal stuff they want to do, but might also want to have a public NFT that has a relationship. You all provide sort of the full suite and the bridge throughout that life cycle.
100%. Yep.
So I want to bring the audience in here because I think that there's an obvious question that needs to be asked is, why not do any of this in the relational database that we have? We have private clouds, we have public clouds, we sometimes we have a hybrid approach. Any CTOs, CIOs in the room, you have to look at that asset set and figure out what's the best tools to fit the problem. And other than individuals owning some type of token, which still kind of feels a little amorphous, we're talking about city government data moving. Why aren't we just doing this on a relational database? I'm still trying. I think that's the question that everyone's asking or thinking in their heads. Why aren't we doing this on a relational database? Are we doing a rip and replace? Are we doing a layering in?
I'm happy to comment on this one because I've been working on open technologies, critical infrastructure solutions for cities, utilities, and businesses for over a decade now. And I've seen this open innovation story play out well before blockchain ever existed. The technologies that we're working with in Shreveport, Keith mentioned that we're using a CBRS network. It happens to be run on the Polygon blockchain. It happens to be the preferred technology for the use case of delivering high bandwidth for a public Wi-Fi program. It's simply one example of a technology that has been turbo boosted because of the incentive structure. But if you look at all the different decentralized wireless technologies, there's actually multiple in this DY space that have been around for a decade or longer. What token incentives did was they catalyzed a whole marketplace, both on the supply side of, in this case, bandwidth and connectivity from endpoint sensors for smart city use cases or Wi-Fi, all the way to the other end where for low power sensors, for the Free Public Wi-Fi program. And we've got a lot of different hardware manufacturers that are contributing to this ecosystem. We have supply from the participants that are standing up nodes and creating capacity on these networks. So there's a whole ecosystem of market participants that have popped up that are new market participants that haven't really been introduced. There's no way that we would see this creation of canopy coverage for all these different use cases without the blockchain incentive. So the proof is really in the pudding. We're standing up physical infrastructure that's out on utility poles and out on city building rooftops that provides a service to the city. That's new. Technologies like LoRaWAN, which is one example of the toolkit that we have been around for a decade. They've been the favored technology for connecting many battery-powered use cases for a long time in markets outside of the US. What token incentives did is they turbo boosted the creation of coverage and expansion of that coverage from beyond mega cities into smaller communities like Shreveport. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna tee this up for you, Keith, because Keith and I had a discussion about this early on. You just mentioned this idea about turbo boosting. This, for me personally, when I was very resistant to a lot of blockchain discussions early on until I realized that it's really an extended part of this conversation around open standards and open technologies, open data, all these things that I've been passionate about my entire career, as I know you are, Keith, which is why you said, I don't care, right? Because what you really care about is this idea of open standards. And Winston, what you said is that, which is what I think is to be true as well, that blockchain is a potential accelerant for all of these open standards to take hold. Like, we've been sitting on some of these technologies for a while, but now you have this incentive mechanism to get people to participate in all of these open things that we've been building for years. So I didn't want to get ahead of it, but I want you to go on your rant that you went on earlier, which I love.
Sure. So I've been writing software since I was 12 years old. I love open source. I love open standards. I love all of that, right? Now that I'm in government, we did an open budget, because how many CIOs are out there that have done like open data projects, right? And then you get like all of 1,000 hits on the website, right? And no one cares, right? And no one cares. They really don't. They want to use the technology. They don't care how it got there, right? And I don't fault anyone for that opinion. We all in this room understand what open technology can do for us, and all the fringe benefits that come out of that and all the second and third order effects of that, right? But to the end user or to the CTO who has to put something on a pole to make the thing talk to the thing, right? Like, we don't care at the end of the day. Now, what we're hammering home here in a lot of great ways is, because the blockchain is open, because it requires a open infrastructure in general to even operate correctly, you're seeing the acceleration of adoption of open technology. And again, it doesn't really matter to anyone out there using the technology, right? But the fact is, I've got citizens in my city in Shreveport, Louisiana, putting radios on their roofs and giving me a network I can use today, and you can use today, and anyone in my city can use today, right? Incredible. If you're in government, you know how hard it is to motivate anyone to do anything for the common good, right? This is the perfect example of open technology utilized in the right way.
Keith, can you explain to the audience how you actually were able to utilize that? Now, you were able to pivot when a component of your solution kind of wasn't able to deliver.
Right. So.
Can you get?
Yeah.
I need a sentence on it. I was able
can
to
jump
do
on
X
it if
because
you
of
would like.
you.
Yeah, let me. I'd love him to dive in deep on it, but ultimately, because we're using open standards, the vendor we were going with originally said, well, we will support what you're trying to do, but it might take 6 months. And if you're in government, you know how long 6 months is, right? Like that's an election, that's a term. There's all kinds of things happening, right? So, no, I'm sorry, like 6 months won't work for us, right? But we're just Shreveport, and so because it was an open standard, CBRS at large as an open standard, we were able to pivot from one whole solution provider to the next. And I'm pretty certain we talked about it, like 4 weeks ago?
Yeah, this happened practically
Amazing.
overnight,
It
and
was-
it's the same hardware. So all we had to do was basically remotely replace firmware in order to support the capability that we wanted to do. Now, I'm going to flash back to before all this happened. I worked with one of the leading critical infrastructure network providers for utilities and cities. We had developed some really interesting open standards-based technology that we invited whole ecosystems of partners into. Their involvement was very much stage-gated by our engineering team's capacity to support integrating new solutions. So when we had multiple hardware products available for customers to choose from to run our networks, a proprietary implementation of an open standard, we had acquired a challenger actually that I worked for that was up and coming in the smart city network space. This overarching company could not integrate even two companies that we owned. Now, fast forward, we could do this stuff overnight with two competing technology vendors.
So I want to bottom line and do some quick summary. We hear a lot about equity and the digital divide in the smart city conversations, and it sounds like we have an accelerant through blockchain, permissioned or otherwise, but it's the token component that's helping this acceleration piece. That actually in Shreveport and in other parts of the country where you need a network and you can't get one, you can actually have citizen participation now to build out the network.
And I'll just add real quick that I think it's the incentivization, and maybe blockchain is powering that, maybe open data is powering that, maybe, right?
Right.
But it's incentivization. That ultimately you need to tap into the selfish
Flag,
interest.
flagging that, because we're going to come back. We're going to come back to you.
We're going to come back to that. One other summary point I want to make is that if you want to consider blockchain part of the open standards, open data movement, I'm just going to say this. The most critical people of my investigation in Philadelphia in blockchain were software developers in the open source, open data movement. Just can't see that connection. So I want to pull that out and basically call it out for what it is. It's actually part of that movement, but there's a lot of resistance to it. Karla and Mike, this is going to Michael, this are going to go to you. We talked about tokens a little bit. Would like you to drive that home in terms of the technology that you're working on. This idea in Web3 that you're the owner, as Mike said, in Web3 you own the data. In the current structure, that means owning this separate piece of technology called a wallet. And either I'm the custodian of the wallet or I have some other entity. Some of you have heard of Robinhood or Coinbase. They're a custodial holder of your wallet. They have KYC, which is know your customer, which means I can recover what's there. But if I'm the owner, where's the recovery option? If I'm a government, what am I doing? Am I issuing a wallet to people? Am I pointing them to a custodial wallet? And then how do I think about the security of those wallets? Because now it's a government interaction with the public. What's the security model? What's the recovery model? And if this is now something that you have to train the public on and you got to get them to adopt, now we're defeating the digital divide solution.
Train the public, train the staff, it's a whole new
It's a whole
ecosystem
change management
of
model,
skill sets.
and I'm very concerned about the digital divide. So for both of you to run with this.
So yeah, I mean, definitely digital divide is a big thing. I'd say, first of all, for blockchain to really be successful and to really get mass adoption, it's not about the blockchain, as was spoken earlier. I look at it as kind of a mullet, right? In the front, it's going to be pretty much the same for the end user, but in the back, that's where all the new technology and innovation is going to be. Otherwise, it won't work. I mean, people don't really need to know about blockchain, which is kind of the fallacy here. I'd say when it comes to digital divide, it kind of goes in that same realm. With all the innovation and incentives and different ways to optimize city budgets, to create new means to get people to take action, on that same note, there has to also be education. We talk about financial literacy. And I'd say, you see that even crypto, I'll at least say the word crypto, adoption amongst minorities is higher than non-minorities. And so there is this element of an easier step in. But on that same note, in order to ensure there is digital equity, in order to ensure that people don't lose their keys, that there are things that happen to maintain our wallets, because again, it's decentralized, there will need to be a lot of education and a lot of ways to also get communities to be activated to learn from each other. Meaning the government, right, can start and promote it and get things going and allocate budgets, but at the end of the day, for these different mechanisms to work, we have to activate the communities. And so doing that with interesting incentive mechanisms like what Karla is doing and interesting ways to get people to take different actions in the city, but then have ownership in it and get rewarded for it and have that feedback loop from the behavioral economics perspective, that's how you can create long-term change, right? And so I think they all go hand in hand, but at the end of the day, for it to really work, and this we'll see over time as different technologies converge, that's when ultimately people will be able to have the ability to do it very easily, as if right now everyone uses Apple Pay or Android Pay. That same way it'll be to use blockchain. And until that happens, right, it'll take a lot of time in crypto world, so in blockchain world, so it's not really that much time, but for it to really become mainstream. And I know we're all working on it, and I think together we can make it happen.
Oh, Mike, I love how you said that. That was perfect because at the end of the day, I used to be senior vice president of Ogilvy and Mather, which is a large ad agency. And at the end of the day, you have to start right at the grassroots level. Because all of the things that we've talked about are super technical, and some people, I could see in your eyes like, wait, what are you saying right now, right? So we are starting in Philadelphia on September 21st, something called villaging. Villaging is bringing back that sense of connection with each other that we used to have 5,000 years ago, and hopefully maybe in small towns in America, but also in some of the housing developments that I've worked in over the years with the National Urban League. And part of what really gets me excited is that we can gather now, and remember, just mind you, I've not said anything about the blockchain or cryptocurrency, so follow this little journey that we're on. But we're gathering at Kismet Co-working Space in Manayunk on Main Street, and it's going to be festive. We'll have King Saladin that does these amazing NFTs, and just like some great food, great music, you name it, hyper-inclusive, because I believe in hyper-inclusivity. And then, well, I really do believe in having this wonderful opportunity where we gather and we start talking about what skills we want to share with each other, period. And in that, we're actually doing tasks now amongst each other. We're actually discussing what is it I need, what is it you need, from our major corporate businesses to our government and to our nonprofits, period. That's what we're doing. Now, our technology is totally built to turn on the blockchain. And now you're wondering, well, how in the world is that going to work? What's the difference? Yes, we have a digital wallet tied to the platform. Why is that of value? Because when I do my gigs, I can choose if I want a skill share, which is now acknowledged by our balance coin, or I want to pay you in cash, fiat currency, which is acknowledged by the Visa debit card that you'll be receiving. Simple, easy. I don't talk about anything else about the blockchain or crypto. So that's part of how we're engaging it, and then eventually villaging all over the country.
So you've layered it in and you combined it.
Correct.
So a couple things there. So you started with community, and the technology supports the problem you're solving. So let's just hammer that home, right? Well, I'll come back and say that later. You said twice already this idea of acknowledging. These incentives are really acknowledgement of some kind of behavior. I'm going to ask you to say it a third time, but I'm going to do it in this context where I'm always a little bit, I have some tension around this continuum between when thinking about civic engagement, about paying somebody to engage. And I love the way that you worded it, which is, well, like, yeah, you can look at it that way, or you're just acknowledging someone's participation in the ecosystem, maybe participation they're already doing. I mean, I think about, like, certainly in just the commercial space, just even acknowledging that we are all the content contributors to Instagram and Facebook and all these big entities. They're not creating any content. We are doing that, and Web3 is sort of celebrating and acknowledging that you are the content creators. You're taking that, and now from a civic engagement perspective, you're saying, no, now we're going to also acknowledge people that are engaging in different ways. We're going to acknowledge your skills. We're going to acknowledge all these things that you're doing. So say it one more time.
Sure. Dr. Robert Putnam. Who remembers Dr. Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone? Some of you do, right, at Harvard University. He wrote about this idea of social capital. I like to call it community capital. And the idea that we really have gotten to the point in our lifestyles where we're not as engaged in our local communities. So in order to really do this, I go back to Dr. Edgar Kahn, who unfortunately recently passed, but that was my mentor. He's been my mentor for over 25 years. He created something called time banking. And the idea was for you to acknowledge that time that we share with each other, that a lot of people have now started to identify as social capital, and even so much as to say, Raj Chetty talks about this in Atlantic, how does social capital connect with economic capital?
Yep.
Right? Social capital towards social mobilization. What if, as cities, we began to acknowledge that and say, how can we incentivize, increase that level of capital that's happening in our cities? Because we've been shown that it has a direct correlation to social mobilization. So being able to now have the blockchain to be able to denote, acknowledge, timestamp that time that we shared, that we know is directly impacting our city's health and wellness.
Yeah,
I'm
I
sorry.
just
So
wanted to drive a point home on that on the network front is blockchain is going to be a means to an end. So in the Ethereum network, I think there's 9,500 nodes right now, and they're all maintaining the same state. It's like, okay, Karla has so many credentials. She's contributed to this much in the skill sharing tokens, however you want to like measure it. So now, all 9,500 computers are all in consensus on what that is. So it's like, hey, how do I tell everyone about what I just did and make sure that everyone agrees on what the state of what I'm doing? And that's the power, because you can build decentralized applications on top of this and plug in, again, with the continuum of permission versus public, but plug in anything that you would want to have measurable and affirmed by everyone else.
Kyle, you coined this statement earlier in a conversation to me, and I want to, so the audience doesn't feel excluded from the earlier conversation, but it ties directly into what we've been talking about this whole time, the open data, the economy. You use the phrase open data economy. Do you want to elaborate on that and kind of make some points?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about today, centralized companies, tech companies, et cetera, your Ubers, your Googles of the world, your Instagrams, as Mark was mentioning, you're generating the content. And, right now, all that data lives with that centralized entity, and there's no feedback mechanism or way to attribute what you did and for you to be compensated for it. So we can boil this down and bring it to like a municipality use case or a city use case is ridership. So say I'm using the bus a certain number of times. I'm generating data about myself, and there's a centralized entity that owns that data. Never before have we had a decentralized, essentially world's computer, as we use it in the Ethereum community, that's going to allow us to track and attribute that data generation to a unique person in a way that everybody else agrees to it. Because right now on Instagram, one entity agrees on what content was generated. that completely goes out the door. And now, again, you can have a whole data economy for a city, frankly, where each person can say yes or no, I want to share my data. And if they say yes, well, then everybody else who bids on that data, like in the Google Click model, they pay the citizen via a token or crypto or whatever it may be. And there's just so much to unpack here. I mean, there's medical use cases with patients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the key is centralized is going to be moving to a decentralized world. And everyone should be actually asking for this and have the citizens have a voice over how to use this new technology.
Can I say why I love this?
I still have some skepticism.
I know, this is why I love this. This is part of the point.
We got
This is what
2
I'm gonna
minutes,
do.
so you got to drive the positive. I'm going to drive the negative.
I'm just going to say that at the core, this is why I love this whole conversation, because at the core, it's rooted in openness. And we've always started these conversations about like this technical, like why as a CIO are we technically going to do this thing? It's almost impossible to have a blockchain conversation without kind of going back to the community, right? Like it's also kind of embedded in it where it's not a vacuum decision. And even though there are a lot of issues, because you're a skeptic, and so am I, sometimes he's more of a skeptic than I am. Like we are now having so many people having this dialogue is kind of coming back to Keith's point. Like this is just the fact that more people are talking about openness and open standards, I think is ultimately a really great win for the community.
And I think also, guys, access. We've been talking about access to capital or access to broadband. This is what we get to build on. And so I would just encourage everyone to take the time to look at it, really look deep at it. Bitcoin's 99, I hate to shout out, but I really love the guy at Bitcoin's 99 because he likes to break it down in the most simplest of terms. Once everyone starts to understand what we're talking about up here, which I think a lot of you probably already get, that there's a pony in there. So explore the pony.
But for the CIO, CTOs in the room or anyone in charge of technology, I think there is a curtain that we're kind of drawing here where on the open standards piece, there's a value proposition. There's a community now incentive to join a program, a technology program, a digital equity program, as Winston and Keith have pointed out. There's a community engagement model, but it has its limits. It has definite limits there. Like I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about citizens owning their data, I get a little nervous because I've got HIPAA data, I've got client-centered data, I've got criminal justice data. I can't put that in a distributed database. I've got to trust AWS, FedRAMP and GovRAMP and all of those other things. I'm not ready to be in a trustless environment.
So many questions remain. I believe we're done. We want to thank you to our panelists for all of this, and thank you all for sticking around. We do have a part 2 of this happening tomorrow. We're going to be talking about DAOs and cover some of the topics that we hit. So join us tomorrow, and feel free to catch any of us after for all these other wonderful things we are yet still to discover.
Thank you. Thank you
all.
to the entire panel. Thank you for joining us.